And this is a more, I suppose, a lot the more difficult part of the book of Daniel as we get into the visions and so on. It's always important, I think, that we deal with those, and so I wanted to, in this kind of going into shafts in certain chapters through Daniel, I didn't just want to stick in the narratives because only sissies do that. So we need to venture boldly into these visions, and so I selected chapters 7 and 8 to treat today. Let's look at Daniel chapter 7 and let's read through the text. There will be one change. I'll read the ESV, but in the last of verse 27 I make one change or a couple of changes in the translation where I think they have missed it. I think the kingdom there in the last of verse 27 does not refer to the saints, but to the Most High, and will translate accordingly. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, the second one, like a bear, was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. Then the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast would kill, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth. I have a mark in my Bible. Oh, it's iron. I marked my Bible, and iron got obscured. Sorry. With its teeth of iron and claws of bronze. And and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with his feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than his companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times of the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. Here's the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So the reading of God's Word. I suppose you can imagine a contrast that there is between perhaps certain movies. If you could imagine a movie of maybe Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, that sort of thing. And then maybe you flip the channel and you see a horror flick with monsters that have green stuff coming out of their ears and faces peeling off of them and so on. Maybe a rough analogy of the kind of thing you have in the book of Daniel. You have the narrative parts of Daniel that perplex us and so on, but you kind of get the drift of them and so on. And then you have these visions, the apocalyptic parts. Now, when I say apocalyptic, you need to get into the act. When I say that word, what you're supposed to do is narrow your eyes and begin to nod knowingly. As if, well, we all know what apocalyptic means. Well, what about apocalyptic? What kind of literature is that? Why is it? How is it? What is it? And so on. Let me just rip this by you. Don't try to take it down. Let me just run it by you quickly. Apocalyptic is a form of prophecy that seeks to enlighten and encourage a people despised and passed off by the world, with a vision of the God who will come to impose his kingdom on the wreckage and rebellion of human history. And it communicates this message through the use of wild, scary, imaginative, bizarre, and head-scratching imagery. That's apocalyptic. Now, as you look here at Daniel 7, you've got a scheme of history, don't you? And the problem with some of you is that you say, I don't really like history. That probably means that you had a lousy teacher of history somewhere along the line that screwed up your view of what history is like. But in any case, whether you like history or not, you live in it. And so you need to know what it's going to be like. And if you're a Christian, how you will endure, and how God will keep you in it. So get a load of history. Let's look at it. Now, I just want to take you through rather pedantically Daniel chapter 7 and break it up in a short phrase with an extended phrase in each case. The first section is verses 1 to 8. We call this clear realism dash the fearful face of history. Clear realism, the fearful face of history, verses 1 to 8. Now, as we look at that, you notice Daniel's vision here. In verses 3 to 8 particularly, 4 beasts came up out of the sea. Now you notice in verse 17, they come up out of the earth. So there's a flexibility in the imagery and so on. But they come up here out of the sea, 4 great beasts and so on. And the first is like a lion, verse 4. Ferocious, and yet this one with kind of undergoes a little metamorphosis, apparently intelligent, some characteristics of humanity. Then there's a bear, verse 5, and he's vicious, has 3 ribs in his mouth, and so on. And then there's the leopard in verse 6, and it's swift and dominating. And then in the 4th case, verse 7, a 4th beast, terrifying, dreadful, and exceedingly strong. And notice the language in the last of verse 7, it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now, 10 horns, Joyce Baldwin says most, would have animals, beasts would have 2 horns. So if it has 10 horns, that's 5 times 2. That's extraordinary power or strength, maybe symbolized there. But in any case, you notice that in the last of verse 8, the little horn that comes out of this, derived from this, this 4th beast and so on, has eyes, the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things, the last of verse 8. That seems to indicate you've got an individual ruler there with an anti-God arrogance. The eyes of a man indicating intelligence, and the mouth speaking great things indicating arrogance, and intelligence and arrogance is a terrible combination. There you have the 4th beast. We'll come back to that. Now, then you say, well, who do these represent? So, well, if we had dealt with Daniel chapter 2, of course, where you have a rundown of certain empires in Daniel's vision, or Nebuchadnezzar's dream there, we would have already attacked this. My own preferences for what these represent, I know there are different views, and there are critical views. I don't want to go through all that mess. We just don't have the time this morning. Sorry, you can read other books on it. But the lion represents Babylon, the current regime that Daniel was serving under. The bear represents Medo-Persia, which would be the next primary empire. And the leopard represents the Empire of Greece. And then, of course, you have the 4th one. Now, some people say, okay, so the 4th beast represents Rome. I'm not ready to go there. I know that's a common position among conservative scholars, or at least some of them, and so on. I don't want to necessarily designate it the 4th beast, Rome. You notice the stress in these verses on the fact that the 4th beast is different. Last of verse 7. And you'll see it more in verses 23 and 24 and so on. This whole matter of it was different. And so I think that needs to be respected. I think E.J. Young was the one that especially underscored that matter. So I would say what you do, you go from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to ultimately a different empire. Perhaps the last human empire, but a different one. And I don't want to designate that or limit that to Rome. That's just my own view. You can take it or leave it. But one scholar, Herman Veldkamp, looks at this picture in verses 3 to 8, and he says, notice what rises from the turbulent sea of nations is not an everlasting peace, but a series of beasts of prey.
each one more vicious than the one before. Is this not suggesting to us that this is sort of the pattern of history? That kind of goes against the propaganda of politicians and diplomats and so on. Sometimes you get I think they ought to know better, but sometimes you get the sense from some of our politicians and diplomats and other head honyoks of the world, I suppose you could say, that if we can just tweak things a bit, we can have a pretty good world. If we can just negotiate, I'm not against trying to have peace, all right? Not a big hawk and so on, but if we can just kind of negotiate things, if we can make agreements to have peaceful relations, etc., if we can just work this, make some deals, etc., we can have a pretty good world. Probably not. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his 1945 inaugural, elected for the fourth time to the presidency, he had one foot in the grave at that point. But FDR said, as part of, you must understand, early 1945, it looked like the Nazi threat was going down the tube. There was a hope then that we could concentrate on the Pacific, etc., so things were looking much better worldwide. But he said in his inaugural, the great fact to remember is that the trend of civilization is forever upward. It is. Is that what Daniel 7 seems to depict? No, it seems to say, here's the pattern of history, and it's pretty nasty stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that it's always that way, every day, all day long, etc., but this tends to be the pattern that you see in history. And I think that's something that we need to inaugurate into our own world view and life view, if you want to call it that. There's genuine hope in Daniel 7, but it's not going to give you genuine hope by ignoring or denying the evil regimes of history. There you have them. Rapacious, domineering, etc. You must inject, a little step away from Daniel 7 just a moment, you must inject your doctrine of total depravity into your view of politics and history. Total depravity, yeah, well, it doesn't mean that man is, you know this, total depravity doesn't mean that man is completely as evil as he possibly could be. It just means that every part and element of man is infected with sin and rebellion. It's like a drop of ink into a beaker of water. It pervades everything. And somehow we believe that. We believe Jesus when he said to his disciples, among other things in Matthew 7, if you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, etc., etc., etc. Did you notice that? That's just an aside. He's not teaching on the doctrine of sin there. It's just an aside. If you then, being evil as you are, you disciples, that's what your nature is. Now that's the case with man individually. And we better expect that that will show up corporately and historically and politically in the way and the path that history seems to take in the nations. And that's what we see, I think, here. You see, you might say with the bear there in verse 5, the watchword to the bear was, arise, devour much flesh. That's sort of the mantra of nations and empires. Get all they can, etc. And that's what Jesus said would be the case in history. I don't know if you thought about it, but you know, Jesus says in Mark 13, verses 7 to 9, "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pangs," and so on. Now, that's often made much of. People will talk about the signs of the end and the second coming, etc., and wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes, etc. And Jesus said all that, you know. No, he didn't say that was a sign of his coming. In Mark 7, those are the signs and characteristics of the present age. You hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. Those are not signs of the end of the age. That's the way the present age is going to be. Nation rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. That's sort of like Daniel 7. Now, let me just batter you a little bit with how evil history is. And as I say, it's not always like this completely every day, all day long, perhaps. But we tend to forget the scourge of governments and nations and empires, and what a weariness history can be. But for example, just take the last century, about 1915 or so, Turkey decided that they were going to kill every Armenian within Turkish borders. Well, first of all, in 1895-96, they killed up to 100,000 Armenians, civilians. Now, these are not Armenians. These are not talking theologically. We're talking ethnically. Armenians, has an E in the middle of it. But these 100,000 killed in 1895-96. And then in 1915, under the cover of World War I, the Turks accused the Armenians of helping Russian invaders. And so in the spring of that year, an attempt was made to kill every Armenian within Turkish borders. Lawyers, clergymen, doctors, intellectuals were rounded up, didn't matter. And many had their heads placed in vices and squeezed until they collapsed. April 24th was the day set to kill the rest of the Armenians. Thousands of children were pushed alive into ditches and covered with dirt and sand. Many more Armenians were stoned or hacked to death. Some had their jaws ripped apart. Women and girls, some as young as 12, were stripped naked and raped before being slaughtered. Some persons were branded on the chest and the back with red-hot iron crosses. As many as 600,000 may have died on that one day. Or you go to 1932 and Joseph Stalin and his program that made heavy demands on the peasantry and demanded the production of more grain than could be produced. And demanded it all, demanded grain deliveries larger than the total crops, and that was ruthlessly enforced. And not fewer than 5 million and probably at least 7 million died of starvation over the winter in Ukraine. Or you think of 1937 and what was perhaps has kind of been obliterated because everybody thinks of the Nazis, etc., and World War II. But before that, the Japanese had attacked Nanking and were in China. And in Nanking, they carried out what has been called the Rape of Nanking. And one writer, a Chinese writer, tells in her book of perhaps 20 years ago, speaks of the cruel manner in which they met their deaths. Chinese men were used for bayonet practice and in decapitation contests. An estimated 20,000 to 80,000 Chinese women were raped. Many soldiers went beyond rape to disembowel women, slice off their breasts, nail them alive to walls. Fathers were forced to rape their daughters and sons their mothers. As other family members watched, not only did live burials, castration, and carving of organs and the roasting of people become routine, but more diabolical tortures were practiced, such as hanging people by their tongues on iron hooks, or burying people to their waists and watching them get torn apart by German shepherds. Even Nazi sympathizers that were in Nanking were abhorred at the tortures that the Japanese inflicted. It doesn't get any different when you come up a few years and you come into the 1970s, for instance, and you're in Uganda where Idi Amin is holding forth. There were bodies floating like logs amidst hungry crocodiles. There were execution cells littered with human eyes and teeth, with gory residue from the sledgehammering of prisoners. Innocent civilians whose only crime was to belong to an unfavored tribe were screaming in agony as their sex organs were ripped away. That was Uganda. Big Daddy Idi Amin, the Nero and the Hitler of Africa, who's credited with killing 100,000 people in 6 years out of a population of only 12 million. It could go on and on and on. Arise, devour much. This is the pattern of history. Clear realism, the fearful face of history. It's tough stuff. This ought to tell us that there's no new regime that's going to bring cosmic therapy to the world. No new human regime. If you then, being evil, and we see total depravity writ large upon the face of the pattern of history. Barbara Tuchman had a very interesting comment. I think she is Jewish, or was, if she has died, I'm not sure. But she wrote a book on the American Revolution called, I think, The First Salute. And near the end of that book, she had a very interesting statement. She said, revolutions produce other men, not new men. And that's the problem. And the point here is that Daniel 7 gives you the straight dope to keep you from swallowing pablum, whether it comes from diplomats or presidents or anyone else. Here is the fearful face of history. Now, secondly, let's look at verses 9 to 14, and we can call this heartening secret. Heartening secret, the firm kingship of heaven. The firm kingship of heaven, verses 9 to 14. Now you notice the abrupt shift that happens at verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took a seat, and so on. What a radical shift. It reminds me of the time in our, I guess our last official pastorate in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. We used to meet Wednesday evenings for a brief Bible study. It was mostly prayer, and then prayer meeting, and so on. We met in the fellowship hall, which doubled as a place for an elementary school that met there as well. And in the elementary school, they had these coolers that had, I don't know, milk and water and, various drinks and so on. There were a couple of them up at the front of the room. And there we were meeting and trying to listen to whomever it was speaking at the podium and so on. And you had that kind of, when those coolers came on, then they made a fairly significant amount of noise, and you had to kind of strain. And of course, if somebody didn't speak up and so on, you really had a problem until somebody would always get a little bit aggravated, and they'd walk up and they would just pull the plugs on those coolers and it would all quiet, and you'd hear perfectly. It was very abrupt. Well, that's sort of the way it is here. You have this pattern of the beasts and so on, and then I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. What a radical shift there. Now, It doesn't say where this scene is located. I think normally, I suppose, expositors would say, oh, you see, it's set in heaven. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say where it's located. It just says thrones were placed, the Ancient of Days took a seat. And this part of the way the vision is portrayed. Now, notice the ease, though, and this is the point. Notice the ease with which final human power is eliminated. You notice, we'll come back to them, but this in verses 7 and 8, this little horn, is apparently a king who speaks with arrogance against God, etc. And notice what happens to him. Thrones were placed, the Ancient of Days took his seat, his clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool, his throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire, etc. Verse 11, I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. That's this little horn. As I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. Such a big problem, such a massive arrogance against God, and then all of a sudden, verse 11, it's taken care of, taken out of the way. Such ease, and so on. Now notice the envelope structure that you have here, because in verse 11 and 12 you have this reference to the end of the fourth beast and a little horn, you might say, and notice how it's scrunched. The little horn is scrunched between the Ancient of Days in verses 9 and 10 and the Son of Man in verses 13 and 14. It's just as if the little horn, in one sense, truly is little. He just gets smashed between the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. Now, notice, why is this such a heartening piece of text here? Well, because it shows us the true secret, the firm kingship of heaven. And it does it in makes 2 points. The first one is, the Ancient of Days holds court. That's verses 9 and 10. The Ancient of Days holds court. Now, notice the term, the Ancient of Days. We have problems with that perhaps in an American mentality, because someone who's ancient, we think of senility sometimes. But that's not the point in the scripture, is it? Ancient of Days connotes dignity and eternity. All right, so that's one thing, eternity and dignity. And then you notice it's in other words, Ancient of Days tells you at least this much, that he was here before any of these empires existed. And then notice too that it indicates sanity. Did you notice that? The Ancient of Days took his seat. The Ancient of Days is not pacing. He's not wringing his hands. He takes his seat. So that indicates sanity in the face of the history that's portrayed. And then there's a third element here, and that is equity. It says in the last part of verse 10, the court sat in judgment and the books were open. What are the books? They're the books, they're the records of all the cruelty and injustice that all the empires and the God-opposed peoples have carried out and inflicted on the Ancient of Days servants throughout history. There's a record of all that. The books are open, and equity that's going to be imposed. So you have those three elements. The Ancient of Days holds court. That's good news for God's people. And then the second element we have to see is in verses 13 and 14, the Son of Man has the kingdom. I saw in the night vision, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, etc. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and so on. The Son of Man has the kingdom. What do we make of this figure, this one like a son of man? Well, just look at the text and pick it apart. He's a human figure. Well, you say, but it says he's one like a son of man. Well, yes, but notice the contrast. I think the contrast is meant to be a human figure as opposed to the beasts that are enumerated in verses 1 to 8. You have beasts representing those empires and kingdoms. But here you have one like a son of man, a human figure. Quite a contrast. And then you notice that he's a royal figure. Notice verse 14. To him was given dominion and a glory and a kingdom. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass. So he's a royal, so he's a king. So he's human and he's royal. He's a king. And he's divine. You notice in verse 14 it says that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. The Aramaic verb is palak. It's a verb that doesn't just mean serve in some bland, nonchalant way. It means to serve a deity. It's a synonym for worship, to serve a deity. So he is a divine figure. Don't think that you just find out about the deity of Christ when you come to the New Testament. Already in Daniel 7 and so on, other places too, in Daniel 7, you've got a divine human figure in the Son of Man already in the Old Testament. And then there's another element here. He's an individual, obviously, for worship implies, if you're serving in the sense of worshiping, that implies that he's not the Son of Man's not some sort of corporate concept merely, but he's an individual who can be worshipped. Now you remember that in Mark 14 verse 62, the Jewish authorities asked Jesus if he was the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed. And Jesus said, I am, and you, plural, you and your cronies, will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now there's the heartening secret. No matter, even though the realms and the empires of this age may climax in one who is all out opposed to God and to his people, there is the Ancient of Days who holds court, and the Son of Man who has the kingdom, and any opponent is going to get squashed between them. That's the heartening secret, the firm kingship of heaven. I was fascinated and amused to read in one book recently about a time when President Lincoln he had a cabinet that, he chose them, I think, but he had a cabinet that didn't always agree with him, and it was quite a trick holding them together. But you Southerners don't care about whether Lincoln held his cabinet together. In one case, he was summing up the discussion, and he said, well, there are 7 days, and there's one eye. The eyes have it. Now, he was the president. He could call the shots. And that's sort of the way it is here. You can have whatever opposition, you can have whatever vicious and evil and rapacious empires that may be dominating the field of history, but the eyes have it. It's the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. It's the heartening secret in the middle of things, the firm kingship of heaven, and that's what keeps you sane. Now, thirdly, let's look at what we could call coming test. Coming test. The final conflict of suffering, verses 15 to 28. Coming test, the final conflict of suffering. Now, this is the second half of the chapter, and I want to just break this up to be kind of pedantic. This is, after all, Bible teaching. We don't have to have fluent preaching here necessarily, so I'm just going to give you several terms to sum up the elements of this passage. The first one is anxiety in verses 15 and 16. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of things. Notice the concern that Daniel has. He's not detached. He has these visions and so on. And you see it again. You'll see it in chapter 8. You see it at the end of chapter 7 and so on. These things wrap Daniel up. They really bothered him. He was emotionally involved. But we tend to think, oh, he got a vision, he had a revelation. Okay, very nice. Do you realize what this cost him? He receives a revelation that just in one sense, psychologically, I suppose, or mentally, could tend to drive him up a wall. He's really concerned to know what this means. It means for his people. It gives him high blood pressure. It costs him something. Don't ignore that anxiety. Now, the second element is clarity, verses 17 and 18. Now, this is important. In verses 17 and 18, you have an overall summary of what the vision meant. Here it is. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings. Now you notice in verse 23, it refers to a beast as a kingdom. So those beasts can be kings or they can be kingdoms. Depending on the reference, there's a little flexibility there. Back to verse 17. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever. Forever and ever. That means forever. Now, there's clarity. I say this because there are more details to follow. But that's just a summary, right at the beginning of the interpretation. Verses 17 and 18. This is clear. Don't go away from Daniel 7 saying, I don't know what it's about. He just told you that. Is there something you don't understand in verses 17 and 18? Aren't those words fairly clear? Yeah, I think we have the sense that if it's something dealing with last things or the buzzword eschatology, that it has to be necessarily confusing. No, 17 and 18, that's pretty clear. So, if you have troubles with the rest of the details, go back to 17 and 18, and you'll get it. You know, if you can't handle the other details, stick with that. That's pretty clear. Now, there's an element of clarity here. Now, the third element here is what we could call severity, verses 19 to 25. And this is where you have a breakdown about this 4th kingdom. I desired, verse 19, to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze. There's a new detail. Which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell. The horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, that seemed greater than its companions. So Daniel wants to know 3 different things: the truth about the 4th beast that was different, about the 10 horns, and about the little horn, that other horn that came up, and so on. Now, this is where we see the severity of the suffering that this 4th empire inflicts on God's people. Now again, I'm kind of pounding at this. Verse 19, the 4th beast was different. And then, in verse 23, the 4th kingdom shall be different from all the kingdoms. And verse 24, another shall arise after them, another horn. This is the little horn. He shall be different from the former ones. You might say in a class by themselves, not quite like anything before, but worse. So, What do we say about this fourth empire? That's different. And this little horn, this king that apparently comes to power at the last. Well, look at the text. Let's try to break it down. For one thing, this fourth empire will have worldwide sway. Do you see that in verse 23? It's different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth. Worldwide sway. It's also, though, divisive. I get this from verses 20 and 24. There's a little innuendo, this one who's called the little horn comes up after the 10 horns, you might say the 10 kings, and he overthrows 3 of them. Now, I don't know who that is or what that will be particularly. Now, what's interesting is that this is a kingdom or a regime that's evil. And there's no coherence in evil. There's division in that. He attacks some of his own. He overthrows. There's conflict within the evil regime. That's important. Do you see that? That's a problem with evil. It's so fragile. There's no unity or cohesion in it. It'll attack itself. There's no glue in the regime of evil. You see that. It's worldwide. It's divisive. And then it's hostile. Notice verse 21. And this detail was not related in the previous report in verses 7 and 8. As I look, this horn, this little horn, this king that overthrew other king, made war with the saints and prevailed over them. And then notice in verse 25, the same point. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High and shall think to change the times and the law. He seeks to inflict and to destroy and to eradicate and attack the people of God. So he's hostile to God's people. That wasn't related in the previous report, but to put it this way, the church is the special object of his viciousness. So, hostility. Hostile. And then he's temporary. The last of verse 25. And they, that is, the saints, God's people, shall be given into his hand, into the hand of his king, etc., for a time, times, and half a time. Now, I know you may have your own view of that. I take that time, times, and half a time as being a relatively brief time. It reminds me of what Jesus says in Mark 13:20 when he said about his people that, let me just pull it up, sorry for I can't pull it up from memory, but in Mark 13:20, if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And it seems to me I take the time, times, and half a time as a kind of very brief, relatively brief and short time. And it reminds me of that text in Jesus' Olivet Discourse, that but for if this had gone on, they wouldn't have been saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days in his mercy of the suffering that they would have to endure. So there you have the severity of it, the uniqueness of both this fourth beast and the king. Its worldwide dominance, the divisiveness within, the hostile element of attacking and oppressing the people of God, and its passing or temporary nature, very brief in its regime. Now then, in verses 26 and 27, you have a fourth term here, and that would be victory. The kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Whereas the little horn, this final dominant king, has his dominion taken away, consumed and destroyed, verse 26. So there you have the victory that is noted. Now, you say, well, okay, so who is this little horn in chapter 7? And again, you say, well, I don't agree with you, Davis. I don't care. But you know, you can speak next year. I'm speaking this year. But it seems to me, given the pattern of the flow of the kingdoms, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fourth one being different like no other, and oppressing the people and being taken care of by the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, etc., seems to me that the little horn is the last leader of earth's final kingdom, implacably opposed to God and his people. And I think he's the one, in New Testament terms, that Paul would call the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians 2. And that John would call the Antichrist in 1 John 2. Or the beast from the sea in Revelation 13. But the point is that Jesus will take care of him. 2 Thessalonians 2:8. That coming of Jesus makes toast out of this little horn. And yet, even now, here's the kicker, isn't it? This is the final conflict of suffering, I think, that's portrayed in the last half of Daniel 7. But even now, across our world, there are various little horn types or early clones of the little horn. Who seek to mash and mangle the people of God. And sometimes you read the reports and you say, how can the people of God, how can the saints endure what they're facing even in our own day? How can we endure, should we face this kind of opposition? And I always, or often come back, not always, but often come back to that story about Ruth Clark. She was went to work for an Anglican clergyman, Henry Venn. He was an evangelical Anglican clergyman, about 1800 or so. And Ruth Clark was about 18 years old, and she had to give work. So she became domestic servant in the Venn household. Housekeeper, cook, etc. Ruth Clark's father had been rather wealthy, well-to-do, and he lost it in speculations, and Ruth had to go to work. So she got work with Henry Venn, and in the process of the years of serving the Venns, her association with Mrs. Venn and Mrs. Venn's witness brought Ruth to a point of trusting in Christ as Savior and Lord. She was converted. After some years, Mrs. Venn died. She went on serving in the household, and after some time, Henry Venn died, and so on. And Ruth Clark was held in such esteem by the four Venn daughters that one of them took her into her own home in Ruth's older age. Ruth was about 67 years old. One day she went out, I guess in the street, and a wagon and a horse ran into her, ran her down. She knew that she would not recover and that she was on her deathbed. So one of the other Venn daughters came to visit her and asked her in those days if she had any doubts about where she stood with Christ. And she said, oh no, I don't, Ruth said. No amazing visions or anything like that, but I have no doubts. And then she said this, he who has loved me my whole life through will not forsake me now. Now, when the rubber hits the road, that's the assurance that you must take into either the fearful face of history or even the final conflict of suffering. He who has loved me my whole life long will not forsake me now. Thank you, O Lord, for the ballast and the anchor that the throne of the Ancient of Days is. Thank you, O Lord, for the hope that the Son of Man is, receiving the kingdom, an everlasting kingdom that shall not pass away. And because we are part of that, neither will we pass away, but be able to serve him in it. And so, in the face of the fearful text, we come to you with glad acknowledgement and pray that you will keep us through whatever we may face in our history. Amen.